Hello all, welcome to week 4 of English 232 American Literature. This week I'll be talking a little bit about the stories we'll be reading. These are pretty exciting stories because they led to massive changes in American society. And in the second half of the lecture is going to be focused on the midterm, which of course is due at the end of this week. So, we've talked before a little bit about why stories matter. Today we are thinking about reason number 4,298, that stories matter. So the stories we were studying this week led to massive changes in laws in the early 20th century. They both convinced the American public and the public's leaders, politicians, that action had to be taken so people could enjoy greater freedoms. So this week you're going to be thinking about what is it about these stories that made them so effective in convincing people that change had to happen? So to give you a little bit of background of sort of the context that these stories were written in, they were written in the middle of a huge push for urbanization. And of course, urban means cities, right? While rural means the country or small towns. So in 1890, the vast majority of Americans lived in rural places. So when we think about rural places, this is going to include, of course, small towns. So a place like Laplace would probably be considered rural, particularly in 1890, while, of course, New Orleans or Baton Rouge are urban. So in 1890, the vast majority of people lived in rural places. By 1910, there was already a really big shift. In the space of 20 years, almost half of Americans were then living in cities. And then by 1930, more than half of Americans were living in cities. So we had made this big shift from the vast majority of people living in rural places, working on farms, that sort of thing, to people being in cities, working in factories and offices. So this means that there was a huge amount of change happening in America at the time. So if you imagine, in less than a lifetime, America went from being rural and agrarian meaning, farming, to urban and industrial. So, a guy who might grow up never even thinking that he'd go to a city could then see his young 19-year-old single daughter moving to New York to work in a factory, right? That's a huge shift. It's a huge shift happening in American society. So one of the things that came along with this rise of urbanism is progressivism. And people talk a lot about progressivism, especially right now with the presidential campaign. For example, progressivism is very closely allied with, like Democrats talk about being progressives a lot. But this idea of progressivism goes all the way back to the turn into the 20th century. Where does it come from? So one big thing that was happening at this time was there was this increasing faith in science and technology, this belief that with knowledge, with science, we could fix problems. At this point, we've got, the light bulb is invented, the automobile, the Ferris wheel, all of these things that feel really amazing. So it's this idea that anything's possible. Also, cities at this time are growing bigger and more diverse. So there are all of these new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Before this time, the vast majority of immigrants had come from Northern and Western Europe. So we're thinking Britain, Germany, Scandinavia, and now all of a sudden we have all these folks from Italy, Spain, Bulgaria. And so there's all this worry because whenever we have lots of immigrants from new places, people kind of freak out. So there's all this worry about new social problems, poverty, worker abuse, child labor and abuse, which of course goes along with not just there being new immigrants, but more and more people living in cities and working in factories. So on the one hand, we've got this faith in science and technology, and on the other hand, we have these cities growing larger and more diverse. And then on the third hand, there's also more and more power lying in the hands of corporations and monopolies. So again, rather than us being a society where there's a whole bunch of individual farmers, a couple of merchants, we have these giant tycoons, right? We have people like Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, Stanford, all of these very powerful people who by themselves are controlling the railroads, oil, those sorts of things. So with all of these things happening at the same time, there's this rise of progressivism, which is basically a movement to fix social problems, right? So if we believe in science and technology, um, we see that we can fix things, that we can make things possible, and we also see all of these problems. There's this belief, okay, well, let's use science, let's use knowledge to fix these problems. Now, the people who are doing a lot of this fixing, they're doing a lot of this work, were northern middle-class women who really devoted themselves to social uplift. This was common in both black and white communities. And all of these women, of course, were already organized because they were fighting for women's suffrage. In addition to these middle-class women, there were also muckrakers, which was a slang term applied to journalists who wrote about social injustices and social problems. So, we have all of these people trying to fix social problems at the same time that we are becoming more and more aware that there are problems to be fixed. So, into this, we can insert two very important stories that we're going to be looking at this week. These are both tragic stories that ended up moving our fight for freedom forward in a real way in this country. There's the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Something important for you to understand going into this is that the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is something that actually happened. This is a very real story, a very tragic story, and a very real story. While The Jungle is a work of fiction, it's a work of fiction based on real things, based on Upton Sinclair's observations and reporting, but ultimately a work of fiction. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is one of the deadliest workplace accidents to happen in American history. If you look at this cartoon here on the right side, what you see is, of course, Death sitting at a spinning wheel of official negligence. And what is he spinning? What is he creating? He is creating the loss of 150 lives. You're going to be learning more about this by watching a documentary online, where you're going to see how the story of these women ended up reshaping the way that the public thought about workers. Another important story is going to be Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. This is an expose specifically on the meatpacking industry. So while the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is looking at essentially a sweatshop where women are making clothes, The Jungle is looking at a meatpacking plant. So this was hugely successful, bestseller, and it ended up resulting in the establishment of food purity laws. So before The Jungle, if I was someone, say, making a hot dog, I could make my hot dog out of cats. And really, there wasn't anything that you could do about it, unless there happened to be a local law. There was no national law, no national expectation that I would be telling the truth when I told you that this hot dog was made out of pig parts. I could just put whatever I wanted into it. But The Jungle ended up changing all that. However, The Jungle is also pretty controversial because of some socialist sentiments in the text, which I think you're going to see some hints of when you're reading it. So these are the two works you're going to be looking at this week. Your guiding question is this. So these stories led to significant changes in our country's laws and culture. However, people had been fighting for these changes for years. So what was special about these stories? Why do you think these stories were successful in making change when other stories weren't? So you're thinking specifically, what is it about these stories that really impacted the people who read them and saw them happening? Okay. So, second half of the lecture, we are thinking about the midterm paper. It is, of course, an 8-week course. This is the 4th week, so it's time for the midterm. You've seen this prompt before, of course. You're going to be picking one of the big questions. You're going to be answering the question from your own perspective, and then you're going to be using 3 of the texts we've read this semester to discuss different perspectives on that question. You're going to be using quotes and examples from the text to illustrate your points. At the end of the day, it'll be 4 to 6 pages, double-spaced. Times New Roman size 12 font. You're going to be turning in an outline no later than Monday at midnight, and the paper is due midnight, June 25th. That's Saturday. You're turning in the outline on Monday so I can give you feedback. I'm going to be able to look at the outline, see what you're planning, and I'll let you know if you're on the right track. So if you go into Moodle, you should be able to take a look at the midterm rubric, which will lay out my expectations for the different parts of the midterm paper. Okay, so thinking about formatting the midterm, do not create a cover page. I do not want a cover page. You do not need a cover page. And if you do create a cover page, that does not count towards your 4 to 6 pages. If you have trouble writing this many pages, then there's actually probably a problem with your paper. You're probably not using enough evidence. For each of your stories, there should be multiple quotes from the story that demonstrate your points. It's also possible that you're not fully introducing and explaining your evidence. Every quote you include should be introduced. What happened in the story when the quote occurred, and it should be explained. Why did you include the quote? How does it support your argument? Okay. So in terms of formatting, here is a beautiful example of what it might look like. You should include your name and the date. The whole thing should be double-spaced without any extra spaces. And there should be a snappy title at the top. For example, in this case, Miss Sharon Lewis writes, "You can fight for freedom, but everyone will think you're nuts." Very snappy title. This is bad formatting. There's no name and date. The title is in this weird big font. Do not put the title in a big font. That is not necessary. The font itself is way too big. Listen, I've been in this game a long time. I can see a paper and I can tell if it is written in 12 or 12.5 or 13 or 14. Just use size 12 font. And then there's this random waste of space that people like to do where they put in the title and they hit enter like 4 times. Don't do it. This is bad formatting. Okay. A couple of other tips. So like I said, the first thing you're going to be doing in your paper is answering the prompt from your own perspective, answering the question from your own perspective. Different for everyone, though, isn't an answer, right? So imagine your little cousin just turned 10 and is worried about going through puberty. He says to you, "What's it like?" And you say, "It's different for everyone." Right? That is not a satisfying answer. Your cousin would then roll their eyes and say, "Okay, but what's it like?" Right? It's different for everyone. It's different in every community. It depends on the time and place. These aren't real answers. I want you to say something more specific in your paper. So if you're thinking about a question like, how does a person know they are free? If you answer it by saying, how does a person know they are free? This is subjective and different for every person. Depends on their circumstances and experiences. I, like your little cousin curious about puberty, will say, okay, but how does a person know they are free? Answer the question. My suggestion to help you narrow this down is you can ask yourself, so what? So if you feel like this is a hard question to answer, that it's really broad, so what? Why does it matter that freedom is subjective? Why does it matter that it's different for everyone? And whatever the answer to that question is, that becomes what your paper is about. Okay. Another way that you can find a real answer is you can pick an angle. So again, how does a person know they are free? You might answer the question with a focus on a specific perspective. So you might think about women, you might think about men, married people, people of color, religious people. So it's saying like, okay, how does a person know they are free? It depends on if they're men or women. Men know they are free by blah, blah, blah. Women know they are free by blah, blah, blah. So pick a specific angle to answer the question from. Or you might answer another version of the question, like when is it hard to know whether you are free? When do people disagree about whether they are free? So if you want to, you can always think about these big questions as jumping off points. That is totally fine. You don't have to stick super closely to them. The important thing is that you've got to be putting out a strong, specific idea that your paper is about. Because remember, when you're writing about the stories, at least one of the stories has to disagree with you. So if you say, how does a person know they are free is different for everyone, then none of the stories can disagree with you. All of them, by default, agree with you because they're all going to be different. You have to say something more specific so one of them can disagree with you. Okay, so one of the most important parts of writing your midterm is proving it. In order to do well, you have to include quotes and specific examples from the readings. This is critical. If you take a look at the midterm rubric, you will see that to do well, you have to include quotes and specific examples, multiple quotes for each of the readings. So why is this important? One, it helps clarify what it is you are trying to explain. When you give us an example, when you give us a quote, we know what you mean. Also, it gives us evidence to back up your ideas, and it's just good practice. Providing evidence is important anytime that you're trying to prove something, anytime you're trying to make a point. When you are writing your paper, I would suggest having your reading notes nearby. They should help you find the evidence and the quotes that you need to make your points. So the important thing when you're doing this is that you have to use quotes to support your main point. Here, in this example, the quotes are not supporting the main point. So we have one quote that's here in red, and then we have the main point, which is also in red. And if you look, you'll see, well, I'll give you a moment, read this over. Okay, so the whole point here is that she's saying that Mark Twain has written this story that helps the reader see how this character is loyal and admirable. And because of that, this loyalty is this really, really important thing. But the only quote, the only example she uses from the story is all about how he looks. How he looks does not demonstrate her main point, which is that he is loyal. So in this example, we can keep the quote that shows us that he's kind of this rough character, but we need to also have a quote. We also have to have this example that shows us his loyalty. And so in this case, he's explaining to the preacher, put Buck through as bully as you can, Pard. For anybody that knowed him will tell you that he was one of the whitest men that was ever in the mines. Here he is trying to explain why it is so important to him that Buck have a fine funeral, even though his description suggests that he would not easily afford a big affair. Right? So here we're saying, like, on the one hand, he's got these rough looks, but he's working so hard to give his friend a great funeral. That shows his loyalty, right? So you have to have a quote that proves your main point. Okay, so this week's assignments. First, of course, you've got your text for the week. You're going to be watching a documentary about the Triangle Waste Fire, and you're going to be reading excerpts from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. By Monday, you need to submit your midterm outline. I'll send you some feedback by Thursday. By Friday, you need to submit your reading response and notes for both the movie and The Jungle. And then by Saturday, you need to submit your midterm paper. Okay, that is all for this week. Thanks, folks.